The heartbreaking reason Ashton Kutcher left Demi Moore is a brutal autopsy of how the elite trade flesh for loyalty. On their 6th anniversary, while 49-year-old Demi Moore sat paralyzed by the terror of aging, Ashton Kutcher sat in a hotel hot tub actively trading their marriage for 22-year-old party girl Sarah Leal. This wasn't standard infidelity, it was a brutal transaction that confirmed the aging female psyche's darkest fear. Your power, legacy, and devotion are rendered entirely worthless the exact moment a younger woman walks in. Just down the coast in San Diego, the atmosphere was violently different. High above the neon-lit streets, inside a sprawling penthouse at the Hard Rock Hotel, her husband was celebrating their anniversary according to a drastically different set of vows. Ashton Kutcher, 33 years old and operating at the absolute zenith of his television fame, was submerged in a rooftop hot tub. He was entirely submerged, surrounded by a heavy, intoxicating haze of alcohol and a carefully curated selection of party girls. Among them was Sarah Leal, a 22-year-old administrative assistant and a familiar fixture within the local nightlife scene. What unfolded in that San Diego penthouse did not constitute a standard, predictable tale of Hollywood infidelity. It was an arrogant, highly visible, and surgical strike against the deepest, most universal vulnerabilities of the aging female population. It was the brutal public replacement of a formidable cinematic legend with a 22-year-old girl. For the millions of women who would soon watch the scandalous details leak across the internet, the betrayal did not read as distant celebrity gossip. It landed like a cold, sharp blade to the ribs. It was a devastating, humiliating confirmation of an unspoken societal rule. No matter how powerful, wealthy, or breathtakingly beautiful a woman manages to be, she is ultimately running a rigged race against the relentless ticking of her own biological clock. The staggering magnitude of this betrayal is inextricably linked to the massive cultural illusion their marriage had successfully constructed. When they officially married in 2005, Demi Moore inadvertently transformed into a global pioneer. She became the living, breathing manifestation of a modern, deeply desired feminine fantasy. She represented the established woman who flatly refuses to be aged out of romance, successfully claiming a vibrant, devoted younger man who looked at her with unvarnished adoration. Ashton Kutcher, in turn, played the role of the besotted young husband with masterful, highly publicized ease. Women of a certain age desperately wanted to believe that the deeply ingrained patriarchal double standard had finally been conquered. She became the patron saint of the post-40 Renaissance, carrying the hopes of an entire demographic on her perfectly sculpted shoulders. Yet, beneath the glittering magazine covers and the synchronized social media posts, a quiet, insidious whisper continuously trailed them. The entertainment apparatus builds idols exclusively for the subsequent thrill of dismantling them. Observers placed quiet, cynical bets on the exact date the illusion would shatter. The scrutiny was microscopic, relentless, and suffocating. Every new wrinkle captured under the harsh glare of a flashbulb, and every slight fluctuation in her weight was ruthlessly analyzed as potential evidence of an impending collapse. The narrative of the triumphant, ageless woman became a heavy, exhausting armor to wear every single day. The world saw the confident smile and the designer gowns, entirely blind to the immense, terrifying architecture required to maintain the facade of a woman who was quietly, desperately terrified of losing a man still in the prime of his physical ascent. The facade she painstakingly maintained was a brutal defense mechanism against an industry that systematically cannibalizes female youth. Long before Kutcher entered her orbit, Moore had been an undisputed titan of American cinema. Yet, as she crossed into her late 30s, the misogynistic machinery of Hollywood issued a terrifying existential eviction notice. Her prime had officially expired. In this suffocating atmosphere, marrying the 25-year-old actor became a highly effective psychological life raft. It was a defiant counterattack, signaling she still possessed the irresistible power of a reigning queen. However, the cost of maintaining this triumph demanded an exhausting war against her own biology. She was forced into a gilded cage of extreme physical regimens, competing not just with younger actresses for roles, but for her own husband's gaze. The fatal flaw in this arrangement was the unyielding double standard of human aging. While Moore fought a relentless battle against irrelevance, her husband underwent a spectacular metamorphosis. He systematically shed the adolescent aesthetic of his early reality television days, infiltrating the boardrooms of Silicon Valley and securing a massive windfall on network television. He successfully amassed the ultimate patriarchal triad: exorbitant wealth, cultural relevance, and the vibrant prime of his physical youth. As his market value skyrocketed, the axis of their marriage completely inverted. The young man who had once looked at her with awestruck reverence was replaced by an untouchable, accelerating force who no longer required a Hollywood matriarch to legitimize his presence. The glittering united front they presented to the paparazzi barely concealed the toxic paranoia brewing inside their estate. The safety net had disintegrated, leaving the marriage fundamentally unmoored and drifting dangerously close to the edge. It was waiting only for a single, consequence-free weekend away from Los Angeles to finally push it into the abyss. On the weekend of September 23, 2011, the brief drive down the coast from the fortress-like silence of Los Angeles to the pulsating neon glow of San Diego served as a bridge between two incompatible realities. The young tech investor was not merely traveling south for a casual weekend away. He was executing a deliberate, calculated escape from the suffocating architecture of his own marriage. He was leaving behind the pristine, silent halls of his home, the heavy expectations of his highly publicized vows, and the terrifying, exhausting proximity to a woman who was slowly breaking under the weight of holding their universe together. His destination was the Hard Rock Hotel, a towering monument to manufactured decadence and corporate-sponsored rebellion. The environment selected for this specific weekend was not accidental. A luxury penthouse suite operates as a self-contained, sovereign nation for the ultra-wealthy. It is a sterile, velvet-roped vacuum entirely severed from the grounding consequences of the ordinary world. To step into that sprawling high-altitude suite is to step into an intoxicating echo chamber where the only reigning philosophy is the immediate, uninhibited gratification of the occupant. The air inside the penthouse hummed with a specific, highly pressurized frequency, the thumping bass of club music, the sharp, sterile scent of expensive vodka, and the undeniable metallic tang of transactional power. He was insulated by the standard impenetrable wall of celebrity logistics, private security, highly paid fixers, and an entourage of enablers whose primary function was to ensure the complete evaporation of the word no. Within this heavily guarded sanctuary, the standard rules of morality and marital fidelity were simply checked at the door alongside the heavy coats and the cell phones. The suite had been deliberately populated with the ultimate, highly coveted currency of the nightlife ecosystem: young, beautiful, entirely unattached women. Among the rotating cast of guests navigating the leather couches and the sprawling balconies was Sarah Leal. At 22 years old, she was an administrative assistant traversing the periphery of the local party circuit. In the ruthless, predatory calculus of the Hollywood elite, her specific identity, her intellect, and her personal ambitions were entirely irrelevant. She functioned not as a person, but as an avatar. She possessed the blonde hair, the unblemished skin, and the effortless, bounding vitality of a demographic completely untouched by the ravages of time. She represented the exact agonizing opposite of the psychological warfare occurring back in the Los Angeles estate. She had no history, no demanding legacy, and no complex emotional baggage. She was simply a vessel of pure chronological advantage, a piece of fresh currency placed directly into the hands of a man who suddenly realized he possessed the absolute power to spend it. As the evening bled into the early, disorienting hours of Saturday morning, the alcohol acted as a highly effective, corrosive solvent. It rapidly dissolved the last remaining, fragile tethers connecting the billionaire actor to the vows he had sworn 6 years prior. The destruction of the marriage did not occur in a moment of quiet, hidden shame. It was executed with an arrogant, breathtaking level of exhibitionism. Stepping out into the cool night air of the penthouse balcony, completely unbothered by the presence of a private audience, the television star stripped away his clothing. He discarded the garments with the same careless, terrifying ease with which he was about to discard his entire meticulously curated public life. He plunged into the bubbling, chlorinated water of the rooftop hot tub, immediately inviting Leal and another young woman to join him. The visual of this moment is staggering in its sheer narcissistic hubris. He was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, a man whose entire financial empire and public brand were built on the foundation of his devotion to a global cinematic icon. Yet he occupied that water with a terrifying level of comfort. There were no anxious glances toward the door, no sudden, paralyzing waves of guilt, no profound realization of the catastrophic shrapnel he was preparing to launch directly into the heart of his family. He laughed in the blinding lights of the balcony, completely surrendering to the chaotic, consequence-free gravity of his own immense privilege. He was a man actively, joyfully burning down his own sanctuary. The chaotic energy of the hot tub eventually funneled into the quiet, devastating intimacy of the bedroom. It is in these final, isolated moments that the anatomy of the betrayal transitions from a drunken, hedonistic blur into a cold, clinical execution. As the heavy doors of the bedroom closed, sealing them off from the noise of the party, the 22-year-old girl, perhaps briefly recognizing the sheer magnitude of the boundary she was about to cross, paused. She looked at the globally famous man standing before her and asked a single, definitive question. Are you married? The answer he provided in the dim light of the San Diego hotel room remains one of the most chilling, emotionally violent aspects of the entire scandal. He looked directly at the young woman and delivered a response completely devoid of hesitation or remorse. We are separated. Those 3 words laid bare the absolute unyielding cruelty of the patriarchal establishment. He did not merely lie to secure access to a younger body, he actively, verbally eradicated the existence of his wife. With a single, casual sentence, he reduced Demi Moore, a legendary matriarch, a fierce survivor, and the woman who had spent 6 grueling years holding their empire together, into an inconvenient clerical error. He erased her history, her loyalty, and her love, transforming their entire heavily publicized union into a discarded contract. The lie was not a shield to protect his marriage. It was the active, conscious swinging of the axe. It was the ultimate demonstration of his newly acquired power, proving that his immense wealth and status allowed him to rewrite his own reality on command. The physical consummation that followed, repeated twice in the shadows of the hotel suite without the absolute bare minimum of protective measures, was merely the brutal punctuation mark at the end of a long, agonizing sentence. The transaction was fully complete. The physical transaction was complete. The carefully curated media illusion of their invincible, age-defying romance was broken overnight. Hours later, the dawn finally broke over the Pacific Ocean, casting a harsh, unforgiving daylight into the wreckage of the penthouse suite. The thumping bass had ceased, the alcohol bottles were empty, and the suffocating illusion of the endless party had violently evaporated. The man woke up in the messy, sweat-soaked sheets of the Hard Rock Hotel, entirely aware that the explosive charge he had set the night before was already beginning to detonate. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, the sun rose over a pristine, completely silent estate. A 49-year-old woman opened her eyes on the morning of her wedding anniversary, staring at an empty bed, completely unaware that the world she had fought so desperately to build had already been reduced to ash. The silence that blanketed the Los Angeles estate on the morning of their anniversary was not broken by a frantic confession, nor was it shattered by a tearful confrontation behind the heavy oak doors of their bedroom. It was obliterated by the ruthless, industrialized machinery of the global tabloid press. In the modern ecosystem of celebrity surveillance, a transgression executed in a hotel room does not remain confined to the perpetrators. It immediately mutates into a highly lucrative, highly combustible digital commodity. The events that transpired in the San Diego penthouse were entirely too explosive, and the individuals involved were entirely too valuable for the narrative to simply fade into the Pacific fog. Sarah Leal possessed a highly accurate understanding of the volatile currency she had just acquired. She was not a naive, bewildered bystander accidentally caught in the crossfire of a Hollywood marriage. She was a participant who recognized that she was holding the winning ticket in the tabloid lottery. Within days of the hot tub encounter, the whispers of the affair had already begun to circulate through the subterranean networks of nightlife promoters and paparazzi informants. Recognizing the rapidly depreciating shelf life of celebrity gossip, Leal secured legal representation and actively shopped her narrative to the highest bidder. The intimate, humiliating details of Demi Moore's shattered marriage were placed on an auction block, fiercely negotiated over by syndicates desperate for the ultimate headline. The winning bid was secured by Us Weekly, a publication specializing in the clinical dissection of Hollywood tragedies. When the magazine cover finally dropped, it did not merely initiate a standard news cycle, it detonated a cultural bomb. The editorial layout was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The layout artist deliberately juxtaposed a glamorous, heavily sanitized archival photograph of the smiling couple against the sordid, granular details of the San Diego betrayal. The headlines were drafted in bold, aggressive typography, designed to maximize public outrage and humiliate the reigning matriarch on a global scale. It explicitly detailed the hot tub, the highly compromising encounter, the 22-year-old blonde, and the devastating lie of the alleged separation. The physical magazines were loaded onto delivery trucks across the continent, waiting at every grocery store checkout line to ambush unsuspecting consumers, while the digital files were simultaneously launched into the terrifying, unregulated ether of the internet. The speed and ferocity with which the scandal consumed the global consciousness was entirely unprecedented, driven by a profound, agonizing irony. 2 years prior, Ashton Kutcher had famously engaged in a highly publicized race against a major news network to become the first individual to reach 1 million followers on Twitter. He was the undisputed, reigning king of the platform, a man who had actively championed the power of social media to bypass traditional journalism and control his own public narrative. He had painstakingly built the very digital arena where his execution was about to take place. As the details of the Us Weekly expose flooded the internet, the algorithmic architecture he had helped popularize immediately turned against him. Twitter transformed into a ruthless real-time tribunal. Millions of users dissected, debated, and weaponized every single aspect of the affair, creating a deafening, inescapable roar of public condemnation. The hashtags trended globally, cementing his betrayal into the permanent digital archive of human history. The sanctuary he had built to broadcast his wit and his tech-savvy persona had violently morphed into a global coliseum, and he was completely powerless to stop the bleeding. However, the sheer vitriolic intensity of the digital wildfire was not fueled merely by a standard appetite for celebrity downfall. It was fueled by a much deeper, far more insidious psychological grievance. When the news hit the digital feeds of millions of women navigating their 30s, 40s, and 50s, the reaction was not passive entertainment. It was a collective, visceral gasp of horror. For years, the global female audience had utilized Demi Moore as a psychological shield. She was the ultimate avatar of hope, the living proof that a woman could successfully navigate the treacherous waters of aging without sacrificing her desirability, her power, or her capacity for romance. She had seemingly beaten the patriarchal system at its own rigged game. When the Us Weekly article hit the newsstands, that shield was violently shattered. The public humiliation of Demi Moore became the deeply personal, intensely agonizing humiliation of every woman who had ever looked in the mirror and quietly panicked about a new wrinkle or a gray hair. The digital mob did not just feel disappointed, they felt profoundly, existentially threatened. The scandal stripped away the glamorous Hollywood veneer and exposed the terrifying skeletal machinery of the world they all inhabited. It confirmed the darkest, most paralyzing fear that resides in the back of the aging female psyche. The fear that years of loyalty, shared history, and meticulously maintained physical beauty are completely worthless the exact moment a 22-year-old girl walks into the room. If Demi Moore, a woman possessing incomprehensible wealth, an army of personal trainers, and access to the greatest cosmetic preservation in human history, could be so easily casually discarded for a local party girl, the average woman possessed absolutely zero defense. The San Diego betrayal was interpreted as a universal eviction notice, a loud, undeniable confirmation that the biological expiration date assigned to women was an absolute, unbendable law of nature. Driven by this profound sense of collective trauma, the public reaction rapidly mutated into a bloodthirsty, deeply misogynistic spectacle. Society requires a scapegoat when its illusions are shattered, and the culture instinctively mobilized to protect the powerful male architect of the destruction by redirecting the majority of the venom toward the easiest, most vulnerable target available. Sarah Leal was instantly dragged into the town square and systematically destroyed. The digital landscape completely stripped the 22-year-old of her humanity, reducing her to a series of degrading, highly venomous caricatures. She was universally branded with the most vicious, derogatory labels the English language possesses. The media and the public engaged in a relentless campaign of character assassination, framing her as a predatory, malevolent force of nature who had calculatingly steered a helpless, wealthy family man directly into the rocks for her own financial gain. Talk show hosts mocked her intellect, tabloids scrutinized her physical appearance, and millions of anonymous internet users subjected her to a barrage of death threats and vitriol. She had entered the penthouse believing she possessed the ultimate leverage of youth, only to discover that the patriarchal machine she had attempted to manipulate was fully prepared to crush her into dust to preserve the status quo. She was a temporary vessel, a disposable pawn who had fundamentally misunderstood the brutal hierarchy of the game she was playing. She was punished not just for her participation in the affair, but for having the sheer audacity to expose the rotting foundation of a beloved Hollywood illusion. The public was absolutely ravenous for her destruction, entirely willing to act as the moral police, tearing her reputation to shreds while simultaneously preparing to offer a quiet, eventual absolution to the billionaire who had actually broken the vows. As the digital pyres burned with a blinding, terrifying intensity, incinerating the reputations of the 22-year-old interloper and the disgraced television star, the true casualty of the scandal remained entirely out of sight, behind the heavily fortified iron gates of the Los Angeles estate, completely isolated from the screaming headlines and the trending hashtags. A 49-year-old woman was being forced to absorb the catastrophic shockwave of a global crucifixion. The world was fiercely debating her marriage, analyzing her age, and mourning the death of her avatar, while she was left to navigate the physical and psychological wreckage of a betrayal that had just begun to tear her reality apart from the inside out. The catastrophic detonation of a high-profile marriage rarely occurs through the dramatic, cinematic confrontations favored by screenwriters. It does not typically feature tearful confessions in the pouring rain or screaming matches echoing through the grand hallways of a Hollywood mansion. For Demi Moore, the absolute destruction of her reality arrived with terrifying, sterile efficiency. It was delivered not by the man who had sworn to protect her, but by the cold, emotionless algorithms of the internet. Within the silent, heavily fortified walls of her sprawling Los Angeles estate, the devastating truth materialized as a simple, automated Google alert flashing across the illuminated screen of her smartphone. In a fraction of a second, the digital notification bridged the physical distance between the chaotic, chlorinated water of the San Diego penthouse and the pristine sanctuary of her bedroom. She read the aggregated headlines detailing the hot tub, the 22-year-old administrative assistant, and the chilling, calculated lie of their alleged separation. The physiological response to profound, unexpected betrayal is immediate and violent. The human body does not process this level of psychological trauma as a mere piece of unfortunate news. It processes it as an acute, life-threatening physical attack. The sensation she would later describe was not a standard emotional heartbreak. It was a visceral, terrifying inability to draw oxygen into her lungs. She was drowning in the dry, immaculate air of her own California estate, suffocating under the crushing, undeniable weight of a public humiliation that had already been syndicated to every corner of the globe. The magnitude of her psychological collapse was rooted in the specific, intricate architecture of the ego that had just been shattered. For 6 grueling years, she had operated as the ultimate defiant symbol of ageless feminine supremacy. She had subjected herself to a relentless, brutal campaign of physical and psychological discipline to prove that she could hold the unwavering gaze of a man navigating the absolute prime of his youth. The Google alert did not merely inform her of an infidelity, it served as a brutal, incontrovertible invalidation of her entire existence. It confirmed the darkest, most paralyzing paranoia that she had fought desperately to suppress. The betrayal whispered a toxic, inescapable message directly into her psyche. You were never enough. The discipline, the loyalty, the meticulously preserved beauty, none of it mattered. In the end, the biological arithmetic always wins. The immediate aftermath of this realization triggered a profound, highly destructive physical metamorphosis. The human body is a highly accurate ledger of psychological torment, and the grief she was experiencing rapidly mutated into a form of active physiological self-immolation. She lost the fundamental capacity to nourish herself. The very concept of consuming food became an agonizing impossibility, a biological function her traumatized nervous system simply rejected. The woman who had famously sculpted her physique into a monument of muscular, unyielding strength, the fierce, uncompromising silhouette that had defined a generation of cinematic heroines, began to aggressively, terrifyingly wither away. This starvation was not a conscious, calculated dietary regimen. It was the outward manifestation of an internal, catastrophic loss of control. When the foundational pillars of a person's reality are violently kicked out from beneath them, the subconscious mind often seeks to exert absolute dominance over the only territory it still commands, the physical vessel. By refusing sustenance, she was inadvertently participating in her own erasure. She was shrinking herself, occupying less physical space in a world that had just loudly publicly declared that she had been replaced. The global paparazzi apparatus, entirely devoid of empathy and driven by a ruthless predatory instinct, immediately recognized the lucrative nature of her physical deterioration. They abandoned the ruined reputation of the 22-year-old interloper and redirected their military-grade telephoto lenses toward the crumbling matriarch. They stalked her outside medical facilities, ambushed her at private airports, and relentlessly documented every protruding bone and hollowed cheekbone. The resulting photographs were splashed across international tabloids with feigned concern, but the underlying narrative was inherently cruel. Society was actively, morbidly consuming the visual evidence of her suffering. The public watched with a collective, sickening fascination as the reigning queen of Hollywood was reduced to a fragile, skeletal shadow, her physical wasting serving as a highly visible, agonizing testament to the lethal power of a broken heart. However, the physical starvation was merely the external symptom of a much deeper, more insidious psychological emergency. The human brain possesses a finite capacity to absorb emotional agony before it actively demands an anesthetic. For Demi Moore, the sheer, unrelenting volume of the pain, the betrayal, the public humiliation, the terrifying loss of her identity, and the deafening silence of the sprawling, empty estate became an intolerable radioactive frequency. She could no longer survive the agonizing clarity of her own consciousness. Desperate to silence the suffocating anxiety and escape the relentless, agonizing loop of the San Diego narrative replaying in her mind, she initiated a dangerous, accelerating descent into chemical oblivion. She did not turn to substances in pursuit of recreational euphoria or the standard, glamorous hedonism often associated with the Hollywood elite. She sought out chemical compounds for their blunt neurological utility, the ability to execute a total, temporary shutdown of the central nervous system. She began to heavily self-medicate, utilizing a lethal, highly volatile cocktail of prescription painkillers and powerful synthetic substances. The objective was absolute erasure. She required an artificial darkness thick enough to block out the harsh, unforgiving daylight, a chemical fog dense enough to insulate her from the catastrophic reality of her shattered marriage. The nights within the Los Angeles mansion mutated into a grueling, high-stakes endurance test. Surrounded by the opulent, silent remnants of the life she had built, she systematically numbed herself. She utilized highly potent and chemically unpredictable substances to detach her mind from her failing physical body. She chased an immediate, dissociative void, desperately relying on harsh synthetic inhalants to force her brain to stop processing the overwhelming magnitude of her grief. She was actively, willfully severing her connection to the physical world, retreating into a dark, synthetic vacuum where the concept of age, the sting of betrayal, and the terrifying gaze of the global media simply ceased to exist. This dangerous, chemical tightrope walk is an agonizingly common, yet heavily stigmatized response to profound emotional trauma within the upper echelons of extreme wealth. The isolation of the ultra-rich ensures that a catastrophic downward spiral can occur entirely hidden behind closed doors and private security details. There were no immediate interventions, no harsh societal guardrails to arrest her fall. She was granted the terrifying lethal luxury of unlimited resources and absolute privacy, allowing her addiction to metastasize unchecked within the heavily guarded perimeter of her own home. She was slowly, methodically anesthetizing herself to death, effectively doing the psychological dirty work for the industry that had already discarded her. The biological bill for this relentless chemical and physical abuse eventually arrived, demanding immediate and absolute payment. The human cardiovascular and neurological systems cannot indefinitely sustain the dual catastrophic traumas of severe malnutrition and heavy synthetic substance abuse. The ultimate, terrifying breaking point occurred in late January of 2012, roughly 4 months after the San Diego scandal had detonated her reality. In a desperate, perhaps subconscious attempt to manufacture a localized illusion of normalcy and combat the crushing, echoing isolation of the estate, she hosted a small gathering at her Los Angeles home. It was a fragile, highly unconvincing performance of resilience. Surrounded by a handful of acquaintances, she attempted to project the image of a woman surviving the fallout, but the biological reality of her situation could no longer be masked by designer clothing or the dimmed atmospheric lighting of a Hollywood living room. During the course of the evening, she inhaled a significant quantity of nitrous oxide, layering the dissociative gas over a body that had been systematically starved of essential nutrients for months. The resulting physiological reaction was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. The fragile, highly compromised architecture of her nervous system completely short-circuited. In front of her terrified guests, the legendary cinematic icon collapsed. Her body seized in a terrifying, uncontrollable convulsion, her physical form violently rebelling against the relentless, punishing anesthesia she had subjected it to. The room, previously attempting to maintain the casual, insulated atmosphere of an elite gathering, instantly devolved into a theater of absolute screaming panic. The frantic, desperate emergency call made to the 911 dispatchers that night remains one of the most chilling, unvarnished audio artifacts of the entire tragedy. The voices on the recording are entirely stripped of their Hollywood polish. They are the raw, trembling sounds of individuals watching a woman actively dying on her own living room floor. They described her convulsions, her semi-conscious state, and the terrifying immediate threat of physiological failure. The arrival of the emergency medical services marked the final devastating breach of the fortress. The flashing red and white lights of the paramedics' vehicles pierced the heavy, exclusive darkness of the Hollywood Hills, signaling to the world that the impenetrable sanctuary of Demi Moore had completely fallen. The private security gates were thrown open, allowing the clinical, unforgiving reality of a medical emergency to rush into the pristine estate. She was loaded onto a stretcher, her skeletal, chemically compromised frame secured by the paramedics, and transported through the winding canyon roads toward the sterile, fluorescent-lit emergency room of a local hospital. The visual of that transport, the undisputed queen of the 1990s, the fierce, uncompromising trailblazer of female empowerment being rushed to the hospital in the back of an ambulance, was the absolute crushing nadir of the entire scandal. The physical and psychological toll exacted upon her had reached its terrifying apex. Following her stabilization in the emergency room, the devastating reality of her condition could no longer be managed behind closed doors. She was quietly, heavily escorted out of California, transported to the highly secure clinical environment of the Cirque Lodge Rehabilitation Facility in Utah. Within the sterile, heavily monitored walls of the institution, she was entirely stripped of her glamorous identity, her wealth, and her cinematic legacy. She was reduced to the raw, agonizing state of a patient in acute crisis, forced to begin the grueling, terrifying process of physical and psychological detoxification. She had to learn how to breathe, how to eat, and how to exist in a reality that had been violently, permanently altered. The profound, sickening injustice of this climax lies in the staggering asymmetry of the fallout. While Demi Moore was fighting for her literal survival in a locked rehabilitation facility, battling the devastating physiological consequences of a broken heart and a shattered ego, the architect of her destruction was entirely absent from the wreckage. He was not required to endure the clinical fluorescent lights of a detox ward. He was not forced to starve, to seize, or to surrender his autonomy to medical professionals. He was operating seamlessly within the glittering, insulated vacuum of his extreme privilege, entirely protected by a societal structure that demands women pay for the sins of the men who betray them with their bodies, their minds, and their very lives. The heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the Los Angeles estate following her return from the Utah rehabilitation facility was of a distinctly different frequency than the silence of her initial exile. It was no longer the frantic, echoing quiet of a woman waiting for a younger husband to return, nor was it the terrifying chemical silence of a mind desperately attempting to numb its own trauma. It was the stark, clinical, and profoundly unforgiving silence of an absolute ego death. For the first time in over 3 decades, Demi Moore was completely stripped of the artificial scaffolding that had defined her existence. There were no upcoming blockbuster film roles to prepare for, no highly orchestrated red carpet appearances to strategize, and most devastatingly, no younger male gaze to systematically contort herself to accommodate. She was completely alone in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar fortress located in the dead center of a city that fundamentally operates as a graveyard for aging women. The psychological heavy lifting required to survive this specific, highly toxic isolation is virtually incomprehensible to anyone outside the elite, hyper-scrutinized corridors of Hollywood. The San Diego betrayal had not merely broken a marriage, it had violently shattered the central operating system of her identity. Since her meteoric rise in the 1980s, her immense global power, her financial autonomy, and her internal sense of worth had been inextricably, fatally linked to her physical desirability. She had spent her entire adult life running a grueling, high-stakes marathon against the natural decay of the human body, utilizing extreme discipline, limitless resources, and a fierce, unyielding willpower to remain the perpetual object of global fascination. The 22-year-old girl in the penthouse hot tub had effectively handed her an eviction notice, abruptly terminating her lease on the fantasy of eternal youth. To survive the aftermath, she had to execute a terrifying, highly dangerous internal autopsy, the easiest, most universally accepted route for a betrayed celebrity spouse is to adopt the permanent, comfortable mantle of the victim. Society readily embraces the narrative of the wronged, weeping widow of Hollywood infidelity, offering a steady, predictable diet of public sympathy in exchange for a quiet, dignified retreat into the shadows. However, Demi Moore recognized that permanent victimhood is simply another form of psychological imprisonment. To truly neutralize the radioactive fallout of the San Diego hotel room, she could not simply point the finger at the arrogant television star who had detonated their life. She had to turn the scalpel inward. She had to painstakingly dissect her own active complicity in the creation of the illusion that had ultimately destroyed her. Over the course of 7 incredibly quiet, invisible years, a duration of time that equates to an absolute eternity in the hyper-accelerated news cycles of the entertainment industry, she embarked on a brutal excavation of her own history. Away from the blinding flashes of the paparazzi lenses, she began to meticulously trace the fault lines of her devastating collapse. The realization she arrived at was chilling in its clarity. The younger husband was never truly the disease. He was merely the symptom. He was a highly glamorous, incredibly expensive bandage applied to a profound, bleeding psychological wound that had existed long before they ever crossed paths at that dinner party in 2003. She was forced to confront the grim, deeply uncomfortable reality that she had utilized his youth, his vibrant energy, and his absolute adoration as a mechanism to rewrite her own deeply traumatic history. She had entered the marriage not as a fully integrated, secure matriarch, but as a terrified, emotionally fractured woman desperately seeking a retroactive savior. By securing the devotion of the ultimate Hollywood golden boy, she was attempting to silence the ghosts of a chaotic, abusive childhood and prove to a highly misogynistic industry that she was still inherently valuable. In doing so, she had willingly surrendered her formidable power. She had allowed the boundaries of her own morality, her comfort, and her physical health to be systematically eroded, terrified that asserting her own needs would break the fragile, intoxicating spell of his attention. She realized with the sobering, terrifying clarity of a survivor that the true tragedy was not that he had ultimately chosen a 22-year-old girl. The true tragedy was that she had actively, willingly abandoned herself long before he ever walked into that penthouse. This internal reckoning required a level of intellectual and emotional bravery that the Hollywood ecosystem fundamentally discourages. It demanded that she strip away the glittering armor of the fearless cinematic icon and look directly at the deeply insecure, desperate woman trembling underneath. Once this agonizing baseline of truth was established, a profound, monumental shift in the power dynamic began to slowly materialize in the shadows. The suffocating shame that the global tabloid machinery had violently heaped upon her in 2011, the shame of being too old, of being publicly discarded, of collapsing into a chemical haze, began to lose its lethal toxicity. She recognized a fundamental, unalterable law of human psychology. Shame can only survive in the darkness. The moment a secret is exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of day, it ceases to function as a weapon. Armed with this terrifying, liberating realization, she made a highly calculated, ruthlessly strategic decision. She was not going to allow the tabloid syndicates, the internet mobs, or the ex-husband seamlessly building his new billionaire empire to dictate the final historical record of her existence. She was going to execute a hostile takeover of her own narrative. In 2019, moving with the quiet, lethal precision of a predator that the world had mistakenly assumed was extinct, she released her memoir titled Inside Out. The publication of this book was not a standard, highly sanitized celebrity public relations maneuver. It was not a carefully ghost-written collection of vague apologies and inspirational platitudes designed to gently usher her back into the good graces of the Hollywood establishment. It was a localized, highly controlled nuclear detonation. It was an act of extreme, unprecedented psychological violence directed entirely at her own manufactured image, designed to scorch the earth and leave absolutely nothing behind for her enemies to weaponize. Within the heavy, unsparing pages of the manuscript, she laid bare the absolute ugliest truths of her collapse with a breathtaking level of clinical detachment. She detailed the extreme, agonizing physical starvation. She meticulously documented the terrifying descent into synthetic drug abuse, refusing to spare the reader the humiliating, pathetic reality of her seizures on the living room floor. She systematically dismantled the glittering, impenetrable facade of the 1990s box office queen, exposing the terrified, deeply damaged woman who had spent decades begging for the industry's validation. By completely unapologetically owning the absolute worst, most degrading moments of her life, she performed a masterclass in narrative dominance. The tabloids could no longer blackmail her with the threat of exposure, because she had already published the absolute worst things they could possibly say, and she had done it with a terrifying, unyielding eloquence. However, the most devastating, highly effective component of the memoir was its surgical dismantling of the ex-husband's heavily fortified patriarchal armor. She did not dedicate the manuscript to screaming at him through the pages. She did not utilize the venomous, hysterical tone that the media apparatus always expects and eagerly dismisses from a scorned woman. Instead, she wrote about his actions, his manipulations, and his ultimate betrayal with the cold, empirical apathy of a forensic pathologist examining a destructive yet inherently insignificant biological specimen. She meticulously documented the quiet, insidious erosion of her boundaries that had preceded the final, explosive catastrophe in San Diego. She revealed the highly manipulative psychological games, detailing how he had strategically weaponized her desperation to remain youthful, convincing her to participate in scenarios that fundamentally compromised her own dignity in a desperate bid to prove she was still the cool, uninhibited wife. She exposed the gaslighting, the shifting goalposts of his fidelity, and the absolute terrifying coldness with which he had executed his exit. By presenting these facts without the protective filter of Hollywood public relations, she completely shattered the seamless, highly lucrative redemption arc he had enjoyed for nearly a decade. The narrative of the brilliant tech investor and the reformed, idealized family man was abruptly, violently punctured. She did not paint him as an omnipotent, evil mastermind. She painted him as something far more damaging to a male ego. She revealed him to be a frightened, profoundly insecure boy who lacked the emotional architecture to handle the formidable, complex woman he had married. She exposed the fundamental emptiness of his character, proving that his immense wealth and cultural power were merely a glittering facade masking a deeply entrenched, cowardly misogyny. The cultural reaction to the release of Inside Out was seismic, instantaneous, and profoundly revealing. The book immediately rocketed to the absolute pinnacle of global bestseller lists, remaining firmly lodged there for months. It dominated the cultural conversation, completely hijacking the narrative from the entertainment press. But the true resonant impact of the release was not measured in financial metrics. It was measured in the profound, highly emotional response of the exact same demographic that had watched her burn at the stake 8 years prior. The millions of women navigating the complex, often invisible trauma of aging, menopause, and societal depreciation read the pages of her survival and experienced a profound collective catharsis. They saw their own silent, agonizing compromises, their own frantic attempts to halt the biological clock, and their own terrifying experiences with male betrayal perfectly, unflinchingly mirrored back at them. Demi Moore was no longer merely the tragic, discarded avatar of the aging female population. She had resurrected herself as their undisputed, battle-hardened commander. She had walked directly into the absolute center of the fire, the public humiliation, the physical decay, the chemical collapse, and she had walked out carrying the ashes, completely unbothered by the scorch marks on her skin. This monumental shift in public perception generated a terrifying, suffocating pressure upon the ex-husband. The invisible, impenetrable fortress of male privilege that had shielded him since 2011 suddenly experienced a catastrophic structural failure. For the first time in his exceptionally charmed, highly insulated existence, the patriarchal pass was abruptly revoked. He was forced to retreat into a highly defensive, uncharacteristic silence. He released cryptic defensive statements on social media, desperately attempting to maintain the high ground, but the cultural tide had irrevocably turned. The media apparatus, sensing the immense financial power of the shifting narrative, rapidly abandoned their protection of the billionaire and eagerly amplified the voice of the survivor. The power dynamic of the relationship had finally permanently corrected itself. She had successfully executed the ultimate bloodless coup, reclaiming her throne not through the acquisition of a new, younger man, but through the absolute terrifying mastery of her own devastating truth. The legacy of this decade-long tragedy serves as a clinical autopsy of societal conditioning and the ruthless, highly gendered mathematics of human aging. The scandal proved with undeniable clarity that the Hollywood machinery will eagerly punish a woman for the crime of growing older, while offering a seamless path to redemption for the wealthy men who discard them. The San Diego penthouse is booked by new guests every weekend. The chlorinated water in that rooftop hot tub has been drained and replaced thousands of times since the autumn of 2011. But the cultural scar it left behind remains permanently etched into the modern consciousness. The tragedy of Demi Moore was not that she aged, it was that she temporarily believed the lie that her age diminished her monumental worth. Her breathtaking victory was the realization that true unassailable power does not reside in the flawless preservation of the physical form, nor does it rely upon the highly conditional gaze of a younger man. True power is forged in the absolute, terrifying crucible of survival. She transformed the site of her greatest public humiliation into the exact foundation of her permanent liberation. The fear of sudden replacement is a ghost that will continually haunt the periphery of every aging woman's mirror. But Demi Moore provided a vital, chilling corrective. The definitive victory is never found in successfully outrunning time. It is found in standing amidst the smoking ashes of a discarded illusion, looking directly at the ticking clock, and finally realizing that you are the only sanctuary you will ever need.